Welcome back. This is the third lecture of week two in data visualization, data 205N, and we're going to pick up where we left off from lecture number two. And if you recall, what we were doing was sorry, I need to, we were looking at the different chart types, and we'd gone through this really quite comprehensive inventory of different visualizations, and we were up to geospatial data. All right, this one. Um, so as I mentioned, a map is a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional area. You know the Earth is round, and so we've taken a round surface and we flattened it into a map. So that's okay. Everybody's used to that. Everybody understands what that means, but it's actually an abstraction of what's going on. So we can show the data values in different regions by coloring the regions in the map according to the data in a visualization, and that's called a choropleth. And sometimes it's helpful, so that's what this one can look like. Sometimes it's helpful to exaggerate the shapes according to the dimensions. So this is kind of like a bubble chart where the bigger dimensions get bigger bubbles. It's a little different and it's pretty weird, frankly. Um, but because people are so familiar with a lot of mapped areas, a lot of times this works. Now, this is actually the western coast of the United States, so it's a little difficult to see that. But see, this is California. This great big thing is California, and then this little thing is Oregon, and uh, uh, yeah, and then this thing is Washington. So if I know what I'm looking at, I can actually make sense of that. Now, these are not widely used at all, but that's a possibility. Instead, you can use a cartogram heat map, and this one is actually, frankly, even more abstract than the cartogram, but it actually works better. So I know that on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, California sit on the West Coast, and then Idaho, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. So I actually know that these are arranged like this. And so this is a sort of approximation of where they are, but this actually works pretty well because of the shape of the United States. You couldn't use this. Well, you might be able to, but it'd be much more difficult to use this like on counties within a state because people really aren't familiar with all the counties or the boundaries of them or that sort of thing. But with something as, immediately familiar as the United States, this can work quite well. And then, so the idea is that you shade these according to a dimension that is interesting. Maybe it's, population or whatever it is, childhood obesity or whatever it is that you're trying to show. Okay, so you have seen this inventory of different kinds of visualizations. We're not gonna hit on all of these in the class, but I thought it was important to introduce you to these different visualizations. It's kind of a blinding array of them, but what you should do, and hopefully you will get this way, is that you get familiar with the basic ones, the bars, the group bars, those sort of things, the distributions. We spent a fair amount of time on distributions, proportions, and on XY relationships. Of all of these, the distribution seems to be the hardest one for students to grasp. It's not actually that difficult, but it's hard to sort that out from a bar chart. So that's really the big thing that I want you to keep in mind on this. Now I want to tell you an interesting story, and I want this is the visualization of the week. I want to tell you an interesting story. You might recognize this as Napoleon, and an interesting story about the backdrop of Napoleon, not for this particular portrait, but I want to talk about Napoleon's invasion of Russia. This was in 1812. In Russia, they called this the Patriotic War of 1812. In France, they called this the seventh of the Napoleonic Wars. It was his last war. So Napoleon rose out of the ashes of the French Revolution, which is a really fascinating time in history, in my opinion. The monarchy ruled for over 200 years, and if you were a monarch, if you were a king, or a relationship to the king, or in the king's court, you lived a life of wild luxury. I mean, you had castles, and you had servants, and you had feasts, and you had all kinds of stuff. And if you didn't, you were probably poor, starvation poor. So the way the monarchy paid for all these magnificent castles and this magnificent art and all this sort of stuff was by taxing all the paupers by a huge amount. So the only way you could be king was if your daddy was a king. Um, so you had to be born into the monarchy, and the monarchy ruled with, quite a bit, iron fist. Iron fist might be too strong, but the monarchy ruled absolutely. And basically, the country was in abject poverty except for the monarchs. And so the French Revolution comes along, and I won't go into that, but what comes out of the ashes is Napoleon. So Napoleon he's not even a French citizen, by the way. I guess maybe he became one, but he was actually born on Corsica, this island off of Spain, and which was not part of France at the time. It later became part of France. Anyway, he was apparently a brilliant military strategist for the way militaries worked in those days, and he was also probably a really charismatic guy, just a charismatic leader. And he had a ser and so, the big issue that France had was Great Britain. They were at war with Great Britain, and besides Napoleon's thirst for acquisition and for just bigger and better and more, was this idea that they needed to defeat Great Britain somehow. And so what was happening in Europe was that countries were lining up either with kind of the British Empire, with the French Empire. And if you lined up with the British Empire, then you were an enemy of France. And so France proceeded under Napoleon, they proceeded through the Napoleonic Wars. It was the War of the Third War, the War of the Third um, uh, uh, reign, War of the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh. Then there were a couple that were named differently, and then the final one was their invasion of Russia. Now, the the backdrop is that Russia didn't. At first, they were aligned with France, and then they decided not to. They decided to align with Britain, and so Napoleon decided they had to invade them. Now, you probably know this, that Russia is a huge landmass, and so Napoleon, and the way that Napoleon won so many wars was he would amass these huge armies, gigantic armies, and they would just win through overwhelming force, because that's the way wars were fought then. They weren't fought by guerrilla warfare. They were fought by lines of soldiers with muskets who would, fire a volley, and then that front line would fall back, and the next line would step up, and they would fire a volley, and the front line would fall back so they could reload the muskets, because that took a while. So when you had overwhelming force in terms of overwhelming soldiers and cannons, you could win wars. And so he did that. Napoleon was, arguably very successful, at least until he got to Russia, in winning wars and taking over territories. And so France kept on expanding, expanding, and that, of course, led to Napoleon, seeming unstoppable. Now, I'll just pause here and say that you've probably seen a lot of pictures of Napoleon with his hand inside his vest. I just want to put to rest, he was not. He did some jokers have claimed that he's got a binky in there, a pacifier in there, and he just wanted to have that edge ready. That's not true. What's likely true is he had a handkerchief there, because that's what gentlemen did. They carried handkerchiefs around, and they very often carried. That was just an affectation that he carried around. It wasn't really particular to Napoleon. That was actually a sign of a gentleman, that he walked around with his hand in his coat like that. And just another side note, I'll mention that like a lot of nobles and wealthy individuals of the time, Napoleon had all these different portraits commissioned of himself. This is when he is supposedly uh, taking off to cross the Alps to invade Austria. Um, Totally fictionalized because he wouldn't have rode a stallion like this across the Alps. He would have rode a sure-footed mule, but that was, typical of Napoleon. He had a grandiose vision and a grandiose personality from what they say. Anyway, he decided to invade Russia, and he amassed a army of, depending on what you believe, 600 to 700,000 troops, 600 to 700,000 soldiers at the border of Russia, and he said, "We're going to march on Russia." And so he starts marching. Now, this is in June, June of 1812. Um, and Napoleon is, I don't know if he's the inventor of it, but he's really good at these forced marches where they march, really for the time, really comparatively fast and furiously across the landscape. Now, what happened in Russia was different than a lot of countries that they invaded because the Russians could see that they were outnumbered, and so rather than facing off the army with skirmishes, they would retreat and they would burn everything in their path as they retreated so that the troops couldn't find any supplies. And so the troops were really low on supplies because they were stretched way out. This is a long ways from France. So I got to look here. So 6 weeks into this. So this is mid-July, 6 weeks into it, he has already lost half of his troops. So let's say he started with 600. He's already lost 300,000 of his troops, and not through battle skirmishes, predominantly through heat stroke, because Russia in the summer is really hot, and the troops all wore these wool suits. So predominantly through heat stroke or lack of water, or lack of supplies, whatever, he'd lost half of his troops. He did have a few minor battles, but nothing major uh, in that first 6 weeks. And so eventually, he he got to Moscow. Moscow is in central Russia, and that was the capital at the time. And he thought that when he arrived in Moscow, that the Premier of Russia would surrender. Well, the Premier of Russia knew that he was coming, and so the Premier of Russia skedaddled out of Moscow and he went to St. Petersburg. And he didn't surrender. He just said, let him sit and stew in Moscow. And so while Napoleon was occupying Moscow, apparently whoever was left in Moscow before Napoleon arrived started burning the town down. Then the troops arrived and the troops made it worse. So they burned Moscow. And of course, the mistake with that was that they burned all the potential supplies and shelter that they might have. So now he's sitting in Moscow. It's getting to be the end of summer, and no word from the Premier of Russia about surrendering. And so he's beginning to think, well, what do I do here? I'm way extended beyond all my supply lines. What do I do here? And so I'm not sure when it was exactly, but eventually, probably October, November timeframe, he decided he had to head back. He had to get out. He couldn't spend a winter in Moscow. At least he knew that. No matter how big-headed he was, he knew that. So he turned around and he went back to Moscow. And on the way back, he ran into some real resistance. And he had a lot less troops now, and he was out of supplies. And as it turned out, he ran into this gigantic river that was not typically, that seasonally flowed quite heavily. This year flowed so heavily that they couldn't cross it. So he had all these troubles and turmoils. And so by the time he got back to the Russian border, it's estimated that 1 in 6, I'm sorry, 1 in 8, only 1 in 8 of his troops made it back. So if he took 8 troops in, only one of them made it back. This whole thing was judged as most devastating military endeavor ever. Now, that was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it might still go down as that. So he took 600,000 troops in, and roughly 100,000 came out, something like that. And by the way, there were another 400,000 civilians killed. So 1 million people died in this war, and he got nothing for it. He got zero for it. So here you are. It's 1814, roughly the end of that. And here you are, you're a cartographer, and you want to draw this so that people can understand what's going on. So here's the map that shows up. Now, you have probably seen this. You've probably seen this in some professor's office because this is considered one of the one of the best uh, stratigraphic maps ever produced. And it's all in French, and it's considered kind of a work of art, and it's just iconic. So this is Joseph Menard put this together, 18 maybe 1815 he was, or something like that. Well, he was, he lived until 1870, but it was maybe 1815, something like that. And so what this is showing, so think about this for a minute. I want to draw some illustration to demonstrate troop force and climate and, kind of all these things on Napoleon's march in and his return. And so this is it. Now this is in French, so unless you can read French, that won't be terribly meaningful. Oh, and by the way, you also have, so you have at your disposal, you have, excuse me, the geographical locations of the cities that he, encountered. You have the troop strength at each of the points along there. You also have the weather. You have the temperature. So Joseph Menard put together this graph that looks like this. Now, so this is Edward Tufte. We might talk a little bit about Edward Tufte. He's an interesting guy. So probably the best statistical graphic ever drawn. So this is showing the losses of Napoleon's army during the campaign of 1812. The thick band shows the army at each position. This brown upper band is outbound. This is Moscow up here. This black band here is return. So here's what he started with. So this is like we were talking about when we talked about that parallel sets map. This is the size of his troop base when he started. This is the size of his troop strength when he finished. Um, on this graph, there are 6 different representations, six different data types. So that's what's so interesting about it and complex and simple about it all at the same time. He's showing the number of troops, which is the thickness of this line, and then effectively the direction, because the color that way is one direction, the color this way is another direction. He's showing distance, so this is actually distance along this axis. So that's what this is. So this is the distance between the cities. He's showing lat longs, which is what these vertical bars are. The direction I just mentioned. She's showing the location of specific dates. So there were specific battles in here, which I'm not going to go into, but there were specific battles where he, had trouble or he was successful. So one of the things that this does is it enforces visual comparisons. So it allows you to draw really fast conclusions. The thickness of the line is the big thing. So very rapidly, I can see this is how many he went in with, and this is what he came out with. Talk about an abject failure. And he uses the color to advance versus the black to return, and then he uses XY to denote the space of travel. It 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 demonstrates causality. So the question is, how does temperature influence the troops? Well, the colder the temperature gets, the more troops go down. So a lot of troops went down, like here, but the colder it got, the worse and worse it got. So on the way back, they weren't dying of heat stroke; they were starving. Sorry, they were freezing to death. And so this is actually 2 separate graphs that are connected with these lines, with these common points in time. So this shows multivariate data, which is data with more than one variable. in a very understandable way. So here's the question. Can you imagine if you got all this table in, or I'm sorry, all this data in a table? You got, a table of troop size, a table of dates, a table of lat lawns where they were, a table of temperatures, all that. Could you imagine how you could put this together in a table and make sense of it? It'd be really difficult. So then you say, well, how do you visualize that? And you come up with, at least if you're Menard, you come up with a graphic like this. Um, you can look closely for these. They're hard to read because not only are they in French, but they're cursive and they're really small. This doesn't actually have any legends on it. That's a very interesting part. So this is a text description, but it really doesn't have any legends. You notice there's no legend here, there's no legend here. It doesn't need it. Legends could be distracting. So a lot of times we leave legends off altogether, particularly when we can make the graphic tell what we want to tell without the legends. So it's actually desirable to leave legends off when they're not needed. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that little foray into. Oh, I just mentioned that despite this huge loss by Napoleon, he couldn't be king, and so he appointed himself supreme ruler of France. He wasn't king, but he was supreme ruler, so he was better than a king, I guess. Despite that, huge loss in Russia, when he came back, he was still supreme leader. And so he went off. You've probably heard of the Battle of Waterloo, one of his famous defeats. He went on to other battles like the Battle of Waterloo. So eventually, they banished him to this island. They didn't get out the guillotine. I guess they were sick of guillotining, but they banished him to this island where he spent the rest of his years in prison. So, a pretty interesting guy, frankly. Okay, so here's what you got this week. This Friday, April 4th, you've got uh you've got the chart type questions. That's essentially a quiz, open book question. You've got chart two exercises, and you've got a week two discussion. Sunday, you need to reply to two of your classmates' discussion, respond to at least two of your classmates' discussions. And then I want to remind you once again that next Friday, not this coming Friday, but next Friday, you have an assignment to show me what you have for your dashboard project. And so what you have to do is you have to find data that you'd be interested in, and you have to load it, and you then just have to take a screenshot of that and show that to me. And we'll talk more next week what that is, but be thinking about what data would be interesting to you. We'll do two things next week. We'll talk about what a dashboard is in case you're not familiar with that, and then we'll talk about what kind of data would be appropriate for that. So if you have questions, reach out, please. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.